Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another talk in our webinar series. I'd like to remember this webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can find the link on our website or access it on our YouTube channel /LIneA MCTI. Today we will have Emir Uzeirbegovic from the University of Hertfordshire presenting the talk entitled Eigengalaxies, describing galaxy morphology using principal components in image space. Emir, thank you very much for coming. The floor is yours.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming to hear it. A little bit about me really quickly. My background is mostly in software engineering and machine learning, data science, but not so much in astronomy. I hooked up with James Geach and Sugata Kabiraj a year and a bit ago, and we started to work together on a different approach to galaxy morphology. And this talk is about that. So I'll start with how the sausage is made, what it is and kind of how we got there. And then I'll move on to some kind of applications and what you can expect to be the benefits of an approach like this. I'll also take just a short detour to kind of contextualize this approach versus galaxy morphology as it's been considered since Hubble. Okay, so a tiny little bit about the history. Arguably morphology got its real start around 1926 with Hubble's sequence. It's a sort of visually appealing design that attempts to order the galaxies into a sort of forked model with a decreasing disk to bulge ratio from left to right. It's tied to the formation history of galaxies, and to some extent, it's been it's been tested and kind of well used over time. And still to this day, lots and lots of projects are sort of dependent on the Hubble sequence ideas and still use that sort of way of thinking about galaxy morphology. It wasn't until the late 90s that kind of this scene started to change with the advent of kind of big enough computers and techniques like neural networks and decision trees, which were really prominent in astronomy kind of back then. And the idea there was to try and kind of flip the model on its head. So rather than having a sort of ex-ante idea of how galaxy shapes kind of are or what causes them, the idea is okay, well, you'd take some data and create some labels and then try and move away from kind of fitting analytical functions to just providing a good data to learn from and let the model kind of decide like what the function is. So in the 90s kind of gave rise to a sort of to a set of analytical models, and that's where he got started. And if you fast forward to today, there's lots of different empirical approaches and lots of kind of machine learning used in morphology. So kind of where we hoped to contribute here so all of these approaches kind of had in common classification. So even with the machine learning approaches, they were typically trying to classify galaxies into something like the Hubble sequence, to group galaxies by a visual appearance and separate them from other types of galaxies. I suppose where we thought we could contribute is in a view of galaxy morphology as a continuous space. So the way we wanted to think about it is, what if we can kind of take galaxies and project them into a vector space, kind of points in space. So now you have galaxy points, and try really hard to make the distances between those points and which area of the space they occupy meaningful. And what I hope to show you in this talk is why this sort of approach is fruitful. And so in order to do this, what you need to be able to do is take a galaxy image, preferably across multiple bands, and think of a good way of kind of projecting it into a point in some sort of n-dimensional space. And you want to be able to do this in a way that afterwards you can test that space and make sure it is useful, it is relevant. You want to make sure things like points that are close to each other are morphologically similar to each other. And you want to make sure that noise doesn't affect the results too much, because there's lots of noise in galaxy survey data. You don't want to, things like, if you flip the galaxy upside down, you don't want it to end up being in a completely different place in the space and completely, with completely different similarities, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll kind of show how we did that. So in doing this work, we used the candles survey, in particular the Goods S subset. We took all the galaxies we could find that had coverage in F814W, 125W, and 116W. I made two kinds of spaces that I'll kind of discuss throughout. I made one which was just focused on distributions of flux in space without any consideration given to the distribution of flux between different bands. And I made another one, which is in the paper, which is sensitive to the distribution of flux between different bands. So I'll talk about that now. Okay, so how does it work? So if I go back to here, here's a little cartoon of a galaxy.
Just a second, Emir, just a second. I have to ask Rodrigo if he's recording. I don't see it. Rodrigo?
Sorry, it's not recording here. I will put you record, but it's being recorded on YouTube.
Okay. Okay, I apologize. Thank you.
Oh, no problems at all. Okay, so in order to do this stuff, we start with a galaxy like this. It has 3 bands, and we want to flatten it into a vector. We start by doing that naively, quite literally, taking a 3-dimensional array. So in our case, it's 30 by 30 pixels and 3 bands, and flattening that out into a single array. You can ask questions about that later, but so many slides I have to move through. After we've done that, we want to make sure a whole bunch of things are kind of invariant as far as this transformation is concerned. So we don't want things like super bright galaxies to be considered as morphologically different just because they're bright. So we do some scaling on the magnitudes to make all images comparable. So we preserve the relative magnitude inside of the image, but we disappear the sort of absolute magnitude differences. We rotate all of the galaxies to be in the brightest plane. So all of these end up facing upwards, and we flip them so the brightest stuff is in the top left-hand corner. And we do that so that flipping and rotation doesn't cause the galaxies to be thought of as different. We clip background noise, so you see all this noise. We clip it, so in which panel? In panel C, you can see the result of clipping the noise. In panel D, you can see the result of rotating everything so it's to the vertical, flipping everything so the brightness is in the top left. And finally, we scale the images to try and fill up the screen. And the reason we do that is to maximize the chances that when we compare images to each other, that the same pixel is roughly the same place in the galaxies. All of these things have caveats, but I'll just say that for now. So we do all of these things, and these specify what our projection is going to be invariant to. So, you know, dependent on the thumbnail sizes. So for one space, which I mentioned I made two spaces, one sensitive to bands, the other one not. The one that is sensitive to bands, I took all the 3 bands and took like the max image. So I took like the brightest pixel out of every band to create like a single 40 by 40, in this instance, pixel thumbnail. That's 1600 dimensions as a naive projection. So if you take that 40 by 40 and flatten it, you get 1600 dimensions. That's a very high dimensional space. It causes lots of degeneracies that are very difficult to get around, and it's not workable. So in order to reduce the dimensionality of this projection and get rid of some of the superfluous features, we use something called low rank approximation, which is different. It's a way of reducing dimensions. So it is dimensionality reduction, but it's not just dimensionality reduction. What it does is reduce dimensions in such a way that the original thing can be approximated as well as possible. So in our instance, we use a technique called principal component analysis. Principal component analysis is an optimal low rank approximation, assuming linearity, which means under those assumptions, if you're approximating a 1600 dimension matrix in 200 dimensions, you can't beat what PCA is able to do, so long as the space is linear. And I'll talk about that caveat a little bit later on. So down here, I've drawn a diagram of the number of eigenvectors that you have to retain in PCA in order to account for different amounts of variance in this particular model. And here I've drawn some pictures to show how retaining 2, 10, 20, 40, 50, 60 eigenvectors respectively affects the reconstruction of the original image. So around panel D, we start to get useful representations. At panel E, it starts to, they become good enough. So in this low rank approximation, we decided to keep 49 dimensions. We did a bunch of other tests too. So we considered lots and lots of different panels, and 49 did the job just fine. That's also low enough to avoid things like the curse of dimensionality. This is what eigenvectors look like. So maybe I should speak a little bit more about, or should I? I don't know whether I should. So if you're familiar with PCA, it's a sort of a decomposition that aims to account for as much variance as possible by finding kind of one component at a time. So it finds one component that maximizes the variance accounted for, and then it looks at the residual and looks for another component that accounts for as much as possible in the residual, etc., etc. And every component has to be orthogonal to the previous. The dimension of an eigenvector is the same as the dimension of the whole thumbnail. So it ends up being a 1600 dimensional vector. And as a result, what you can do is fold that back up to a 40 to 40 thumbnail to see what it emphasizes and de-emphasizes. So when you do that in our model, this is what you get. You get a sort of set of template shapes, the combination of which is able to reconstruct any given galaxy to a certain fidelity. The first and the second are a little bit meaningful, but as you go on, that orthogonality constraint makes the eigenvectors look more and more complicated for reasons other than something you can interpret. But they're pretty, so I thought I'd show you. Okay, so now at this point in time, what we have is a 49-dimensional space, which does a good job of reconstructing galaxy images in with a bunch of invariances added. So because before we did PCA, we did this process of scaling and rotating and flipping and whatnot. Our final space ends up being invariant to all those things. So we've got a 49-dimensional space with a whole bunch of invariances. So far, so good. Now we want to test if it's any good. And here are some basic tests that you can do on the space. So in these panels, what I've done is picked just random galaxies. And I did this for hundreds of panels. And then for each random galaxy, all of the other ones, all the other galaxies are just the nearest neighborhood. So all of the galaxies that are most similar to the galaxy in the top left of each panel. And if the space is doing a good job, then the stuff around the galaxy ought to look very similar to the galaxy. It ought to have a sort of intuitive similarity. So in this instance, I think it does. And this is one test. Another thing that you want the space to do is be really sensitive to like the covariances between the pixels. So when you do the flattening, what you lose is adjacency. So you don't know what, the pixels that are next to each other are just coincidentally so, and that doesn't really matter. And you really want the covariances between the pixels to be meaningful. So what I've done here is for the space, I've randomized the orders of the rows and columns to see how many eigenvectors it takes to explain the covariance. So when you totally randomize rows and columns, you get a sort of, something approaching a straight line. When you just randomize the columns, so that's like keeping the marginal distributions of all the pixels, but losing all covariance, you start to get a curvature. But when you leave when you leave the data as it is, when the covariance is in place, you get this massive curvature, i.e. the number of eigenvectors that it takes to explain the space, given the covariance, becomes exponentially smaller. And you want that to be the case because your spatial morphology is really embedded in the covariances. So you want your final space to be really, really responsive to covariance. And this sort of diagrams tries to motivate that fact. The final thing you can do, so PCA is a bit rubbish, like most linear techniques, if the space isn't particularly linear. So an example of a non-linear space would be something that has clusters in it. So if you've got something that has like three clusters, the way PCA might divide that up could be completely weird. Some sort of natural curvature, a torus, any sort of non-linearity will cripple PCA quite badly if it's very pronounced. And you can test to see whether that's the case by taking your data, leaving a bunch of it out, and then fitting PCA to see how much variance you explain with some number of components. So these two panels show PCA fitted like 1,000 times, keeping 70% of the data. So 30% of the data, so 70% of the data is collected at random. And I drew two histograms showing what happens with the explained variance on the first component, which explains the most variance, and the 49th component, which is the last one we pick. You get something, what you want to see is, first of all, a small difference, which you see here. So the histogram ranges from 0.86 to 0.866, from like 0.21 to 0.222. So it's a very small range, and it's a fairly symmetrical range. So those three things test that the space kind of is likely to do what you think it is, and that's good. This is the last feature of the space that I'll just kind of say before moving on to applications and what you can do with it. Okay, so it turns out that PCA and factor models have something in common, in particular latent factor models. So in a latent factor model, what you're trying to do is project you're trying to project some vector space into another vector space that has fewer dimensions. And it just so happens that if your variance model in a factor model is isotropic, then the optimal solution in the model will be exactly the same as that of PCA. And the reason that this is very useful is because PCA is useful for the reasons I've just said, and factor models are probabilistic. So being able to convert from PCA to a factor model enables you to add a probabilistic interpretation to your PCA. So as it turns out, PCA is equivalent to a certain type of multivariate Gaussian. And this is very useful because it allows us to ascribe a probability to every galaxy point. And as I'll show you, this is going to be useful for things like outlier detection and predicting missing values. But it's also useful for summarizing and comparing data sets. So because we can think of PCA via factor models as a multivariate Gaussian, we can effectively summarize a data set using just the mean and covariance information that we calculate from the low rank approximation that I just talked about. The reason this is cool is because we can use this to compare two data sets to each other via a measure of divergence called the Kullback-Leibler divergence. So that's a way of quantifying like how different two probability distributions are. And it just turns out that for multivariate Gaussians, it has a closed form. So what I've done in this diagram is the Kullback-Leibler divergence just goes from 0 to like forever, and it doesn't have like a natural interpretation. So if the divergence is 600, it doesn't mean anything obvious. So in order to kind of calibrate the divergence to something useful, so I could show you the next slide, what I've done here is I've taken just samples of the data, fitted our space to it, and then compared it to the space fitted to the full data. So what you see down here at the bottom is the size of the sample, and what you see on the y-axis is the amount of divergence. So I calculate our invariant lower rank approximation for the sample and for the total space. I work out the Gaussian via the factor model stuff, and I compare the two distributions to see what the divergence is. And naturally, you see what you expect to see, which is that as the sample size increases, the divergence goes to 0. So when we're close to like 100% sample, then there's no divergence between the two, and this is fine. And the reason this is useful is that we can use it to do things like ask a question, like how well does this sample approximate the full survey? All right. So we're into applications now. Here's the reason that specific thing is interesting. So first of all, we can use this result to do something called leverage scoring in order to pick a sample out of a survey that does a lot better at approximating the survey than random sampling. So here I've drawn, so this is what your random sample looks like, the blue line. Here I use leverage scores to pick a sample from the survey. And what it shows is, so if you look at, let's say, the 20% fraction using leverage scores, and the how big a random sample would have to be to have the same Kullback-Leibler divergence with the full data set. So what it shows is that at 20% small sample where it's most relevant, you need about 2.5 fewer rows using this sampling scheme than you need if you were just doing random sampling. And this is particularly relevant to very large data sets. I won't go into this too much because you could almost talk about it for an hour, but there are alternative sampling schemes, so long as you have a metric like this to optimize against, that will just drastically reduce how many samples you have to collect before it represents your survey. Okay, other applications. A really obvious application for this vector space is clustering. So because you have points in space, you can compare all points to all points and create a distance matrix. Once you've made a distance matrix, you can feed this directly into like a dozen different clustering algorithms that will all give you different things dependent on what it does. So this is an example of a bunch of clusters created using an algorithm called affinity propagation, which is nice because you don't have to specify how many clusters there are. Similarity search it's very natural. So if you find a galaxy that you like and you want to find more galaxies that look like it, you can just look for the nearest neighbors to that galaxy. So in these panels, the top left is a reference galaxy and all the other ones are its nearest neighbors. This sort of thing works very reliably. You can use that probabilistic extension along with a maximum likelihood type algorithm to impute data in a way that nothing else does, as far as I know. So in this instance, I left out random bands, so not just like a pixel here and there, but like a whole band. And then I used a sort of maximum likelihood algorithm to impute the missing band using the probabilistic interpretation of kind of PCA as a Gaussian. And yeah, it's able to get some really good results. In particular, it's able to impute the shape of things even when the shape looks nothing like the shape apparent in the other bands. So it does a really good job of using information both in the rows, so information about the image itself, and columns, which is other image, same pixels but in other images. Outlier detection. I can't actually tell how much time I've got left. Let me see. Okay, it should be there somewhere. Outlier detection. So because we can ascribe probabilities to galaxies now, it's easy to just ask for all of the low probability galaxies. So in the space that doesn't care about bands, panel A is what the low probability bands look like, which you would expect. You'd expect them to be noise, because noise is a sort of random distribution in space. And this is what the most likely ones look like. In a space that also includes the flux differences between bands, you get something like this. So like in panel C, where you can see much more astronomically relevant types of events. Yeah, and that's it. So those are all of the applications. And the reason that vector spaces are useful. So I'll stop here and take questions if there are any.
Hi, it's Julia. You mentioned that you can have more than one image for the same filter. So are you using co-added images or single epoch images?
Co-added images.
And where the number of images is applied?
So the only thing I worry about, so like way back at the start, so for each band I end up with images that had been pre-processed already. So they'd usually been drizzled and otherwise pre-processed. And then what I end up with is like fits files for each band as a single image. So the only way that a galaxy is represented in terms of multiple images is in the sense that these bands are overlaid onto each other. So I have the galaxy imaged along 3 bands. How each band is constructed, if that's what you're asking, is something that Candles kind of already took care of.
Okay, I see. So if you have, for example, two images in the 2 bands, you can predict the missing band based on similar galaxies that has both the 3.
Exactly, yeah. So you got kind of like 2 big sources of information. One is like what happens in the other bands for that galaxy, and the other one is how that galaxy co-varies with all the other galaxies. And then you can use that covariance information to impute things like the shape in a missing band, although the shape isn't actually evident in the other bands for that galaxy.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, more questions? Well, I have two questions, Emir. First is, it's more concerning the PCA itself. How do you differentiate among shapes? I suppose you will have different eigenvalues and eigenvectors for each galaxy shape, or did I misunderstand it?
So a galaxy in this model is, so initially it's just a vector of pixels. So imagine each of these was like a 30 by 30 thumbnail. So you had a 30 by 30 thumbnail for 814W and for 125W and 160W. And you can think of that as like a 3D block, right? So 30 by 30 and then 3 layers. And you just flatten that into a single vector. So you end up with a 30 by 30, which is like 900 times 3, which is 2,700 dimensions in that example. And what your galaxy is that single point in a 2,700 dimensional space. And if that's all you did, you get terribly useless results. So your galaxy no longer has like a shape per se. It just has a point in space. Now, the first thing we do is make that space more relevant by adding invariances. So stuff like rotation not making a difference, et cetera, and then we make that space smaller. So we reduce it in the first case from like 1,600 dimensions to 49. Or in the paper, we reduce it from 2,700 dimensions to just 12. It turns out just looking at spatial information requires a lot more dimensions than looking at both space and flux, because flux does a lot to differentiate galaxies. Does that make sense? So there's no shape per se, it's just points in space.
Okay, yes, it makes sense. But now I don't know if my next question makes sense. As once you reduce from 1,600 to 49 dimensions, I don't know, do you, you explained a lot about how to choose the eigenvectors, I assume, but do you have to cut in some moment to choose only the more energetic eigenvectors? Is this the transformation of 1,600 to 49 dimensions?
So
It's a cutoff?
In this panel, so the original is in A, and B is the approximation that you get if you just had 2 eigenvectors. And then C is what you'd get if you kept 10, and then this is 20, and then E is 40, and so on and so forth. Because PCA is not just dimension reduction, so it's not like an embedding. It is an embedding, but it's not just an embedding. When you decide on a number of dimensions, what you're able to do is regenerate the image and see how well that number of dimensions approximates the original. You can, as in you just visually see that. So what we did is just visually looked at a large number of panels of random galaxies to see roughly at what cut they remained like visually relevant. And 49 was a good cut from a just visual perspective. Does that make sense? Because in the end, you want all of the correspondences to be visual. You want to be able to intuit what's going on.
Yes, that was exactly my doubt. How would you actually, what was behind the cut that you elected in the 49th? dimension.
staring, lots of staring.
Yeah, because actually this is a very interesting problem when you do this type of kind of PCA, or how do you like where you will make the cut.
Yeah,
okay, thank you very much.
The explained variance means almost nothing in some sense. You'll see in the paper where we only kept 12 eigenvectors, the explained variance is higher with just 12. And the reason for that is if when you include flux differences can be large, and just accounting for a flux difference accounts for a lot of variance. So it looks as if far fewer dimensions do far more work, but it's not that useful. I think the end calibration has to be visual.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have time for more questions. So, more questions?
I think Emir was going to continue the presentation. Am I right?
Okay.
Oh no, I've got nothing else to say.
Okay.
That's all. It was a little bit wordy and technical, so I apologize to everybody. So I figured, leave it open for questions if people had questions.
Okay, sorry.
It's just quite a lot of stuff in this when thinking about things in vector spaces. Like the subtleties are really, really important. So I think astronomers are quite used to like embeddings. So when you take something like, so for instance, if you take like the CAS metrics or the M20 in Gini or something like that, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to make an embedding by drawing all of the galaxies in a sort of three-dimensional graph according to their values, according to their M20 Gini and whatever values. And then you end up with a sort of point in space representation, but you can't take that point and then generate what that galaxy looks like. It's an embedding, but it's not a low rank approximation. And between the two, there's like a really big difference, but it's kind of fairly subtle if it's not what you mostly think about. So the paper is full of these subtleties, and we've done our best to try and explain them.
Okay, thank you, Emir. I think there are no more questions. This presentation will be available on our website, linea.com.br, and on LIneA's YouTube channel. So for the next week's webinar, we will have Vivian Miranda from the University of Arizona. She will talk about the connected universe, relating early, intermediate, and late universe with cosmological data. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and a special thanks to Emir.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Okay, so everyone, have a great day, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.